critical thinking and ethics in public speaking. We need to understand that as you move forward through the rest of this semester and out into the professional arena, you have to understand that while we have the First Amendment and protection under that First Amendment for free speech, that there's also the responsibility of the speaker to think critically about that rhetorical occasion or situation that we've talked about so many times this semester. To understand, why have you been chosen to speak? What occasion is it? Who is your audience, and how are you planning to identify with them and resonate with them, as well as what are your ethical responsibilities to respecting your audience, and what is your goal to inform them or persuade them, and how are you most successfully going to do that? In this short lesson, we're going to discuss critical thinking skills and understanding how those critical thinking skills also play a part in understanding our rights under the First Amendment for free speech. Let's think about critical thinking and the role of public speaking and ethics. While all things are permissible, not all things are beneficial. We understand that while free speech, I am not someone who believes in politically correct speech. In other words, there is no abridging your right as an American citizen to free speech, whether it's criticizing the government or any other form of free speech. But what we do have to think about as being an educated individual, how do we think critically about who our audience is and how we're going to communicate effectively in a way that is not going to be off-putting. Now, sometimes there are occasions that we want to create strife or aggravation because we're trying to speak out for a cause. But once again, understanding the responsibilities and the roles that you have as a speaker and how that's going to impact the audience's kind of analysis of what you're saying and how they're buying into that. So it's understanding, assessing the underlying assumptions, not only of you as a speaker, but about your audience. Who are my audience and how am I going to connect with them? But also as we are looking at watching and listening to other people's speeches in a political season, for instance. How do we assess their underlying assumptions about the topic or our point of view, the implications that their messages may have, and the consequences of that message? Remember that when we put something out there, a message, there might be unintended consequences as well. That creating shared meaning is part of the goal of communication, but we have to realize how other people are going to take the message is maybe counter to the meaning that we have for it. So being a critical thinker. As we look at, let's say, politicians, how do we discern, being that critical audience member, between fact, what is this individual talking about that has been observed, directly observed, that they know for a fact? Or where did they get that information from that was directly observable through a study that's firsthand research? Or is it an opinion? Let's say Donald Trump is talking about something. Is it a fact? Where did he get that information? Is it credible, objective, and current? Or is it an opinion? Realizing how we understand and critically analyze other people's messages. And then, of course, realizing that we have to investigate the legitimacy of this message or this meaning. And so as you are preparing to give your persuasive speech, your audience is going to be asking the same thing. Is this a fact, and where did this speaker come up with this fact? A statistic, possible demographics or numbers, or is it an opinion that we can decide whether or not we're going to buy into? And where is that legitimacy of information coming from? That's why we ask that you quote or cite orally your sources so that we can judge for ourselves how credible you are, and that argument is. Now we're going to move into the First Amendment, realizing that many of you might be history majors and you know this, but it's very critical for you as a speaker to understand your rights of free speech granted to you by the First Amendment. Now, the Constitution was ratified in 1788, but what the Founding Fathers realized was that we want to temper the power of the federal government. And their answer to tempering the power of the federal government was to create the first 10 amendments to the Constitution, which then become our Bill of Rights. Now, the first right that you have as a citizen is the right of free speech. The First Amendment. Congress, if you don't know this already, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or the practice or prohibiting the exercise thereof. So that's the first part of the First Amendment. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment or religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. Now the second part of the First Amendment is or abridging, to cut short, or abridging the freedom of speech or of the press. So that's the second part of the First Amendment. Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech or of the press. Now the third part of the First Amendment is or the right of the people to peaceably assemble. Now, do you have the right to assemble in a volatile or kind of mob mentality way where you're causing and wreaking havoc in society? No, you don't. You have the right, though, to peaceably assemble and to petition the government for a redress of grievances. A beautiful example of this peaceably assembling is in the 1960s with UC Berkeley, where they had, we'll get into this, but where the environment led up to a situation where students protested because their freedom of speech was being cut short by UC Berkeley. And so I'll post that video online. Now, the Constitution was ratified in 1788. The Bill of Rights was created to temper the government and their control over the American citizens. But almost immediately, challenges to the First Amendment came up. And when we start at the beginning, and I know this is small for you, and so I'm going to kind of make this a little larger. Whoops, let's go back here. Make this a little larger. In 1798, the Alien Sedition Acts prohibited speech or actions that threatened to criticize the government. And people were jailed because they were criticizing the government. After John Adams' presidency ended, that bill expired and people were once again freed. But in World War II, we had another resurgence of this challenge to the First Amendment. Any speech that presented a clear or present danger to the government. In other words, were they threatening the government's control? And so this is a very instrumental case, Schenck versus the United States. And this is, of course, before we have printers and copiers, but he created 15,000 pamphlets or bulletins that he passed out, and he actually dropped to people because they were drafting young men into the service for World War I. And on this, it said, assert your rights, do not submit to intimidation. And he was jailed for this because it was some language that the government felt presented a clear and present danger. And so Schenck was jailed, and this is where you come up with associations, ACLU, that were created to defend people against actions that abbreviated or abridged their freedom of speech. Then we look at in the 1940s, Congress passed legislation that would criminalize any speech that would incite the overthrow of the government. Once again, we're back at this. And then in the 1960s, what do we have? We have a time that is kind of social and time of protest, obviously, civil rights movement, but also you're kind of going into the Vietnam War, and so you've got some social upheaval in the United States. And this seminal case was created in 1964 with UC Berkeley, University of California at Berkeley, where the dean, Catherine Towle, and the Board of Regents created an oath of loyalty. And this oath of loyalty was an insurance or an assurance for UC Berkeley that they wouldn't have faculty members that were joining the Communist Party. That's really what this was about. And so what they did was they forced faculty members to sign this oath of loyalty that they would not, of course, they would deny any belief in or membership in any kind of communist organization advocating the overthrow of the government. And over 40 faculty members were fired because they would not sign this oath of loyalty. At the same time, on University of California at Berkeley, on the campus, the students were not allowed to speak politically, have any kind of political speech on campus. And this created, they had five students where they were trying to, protest in a peaceable manner, but they were threatened to be thrown out of school. And that created kind of a huge wave where, once again, I will post this video, where students started to assemble around these five that had been basically thrown out, been threatened to been thrown out of UC Berkeley. And what ended up happening was that at some point in time, they had over 6,000 students sitting around this police car where this one student had been confined. And that student sat in the police car for over 36 hours. But what this showed was this unified effort to ensure free speech on the campus. And the students weren't thrown out of Berkeley. Of course, faculty members did not come out of the buildings. They were afraid because of the environment that it had created. But they peaceably, as you can see in these pictures, they peaceably assembled to assert their rights. And they would take off their shoes and step onto the hood of the car everybody had the microphone for about 3 minutes, and you could say whatever you wanted to say. What this did ultimately was it created what was known as a free university and a free society, the free speech movement of universities. And of course now, even here at the University of Alabama, you have to register before you do any kind of social protest on campus with a certain office over at the FERG and Student Services, and I think you have to give them 10 days. And so we still have to work within the confines, but that you do have that opportunity. And so on a different type of note, when we look at free speech under the First Amendment, also the right to burn the U.S. flag is protected under the First Amendment. And in 1989, the U.S. Supreme Court decided in favor of the rights of Gregory Johnson. Gregory Johnson had burned the American flag and had been convicted. What happened was that the U.S. Supreme Court decided that actually it was protected under the First Amendment as a nonverbal speech act. In other words, it was a speech act, a behavior that is viewed by law as nonverbal communication and subject to the same protections and limitations as verbal speech. And so when we look at the responsibility of free speech, we know that we can say anything. We are granted that, even if we're criticizing our own government. However, and there are some crazy radical groups, yes, in the United States, they are free to say whatever they want to. But when you look at some examples here, you can say whatever, but you have to think about your audience. And employers, if they're private employers, can decide whether or not your actions, your words are representing them well, and they have the right as a private employer to fire you. And we look at different cases like Don Imus and Isaiah Washington, who both said things that were either racially slurs or other type of social slurs, and what happened is that there's some kind of social sanction against those individuals. And so you have to balance your right of free speech versus understanding those unintended consequences that may come from them. And that's what you have to do as a public speaker and as a citizen in that way, to realize who your audience is, what platform you're getting that message out, and how to choose those words wisely to make the most of that message in any circumstance.